In 1915, in the deep, silent woods of the Missouri Ozarks, a 12-year-old girl named Clara Caldwell became the center of a mystery that science itself could not explain. It began, as these things often do, with a silence that was too loud. For 2 weeks, no smoke had risen from the Caldwell homestead's chimney, a death sentence in the bitter December cold. Neighbors, their unease growing with each passing day, finally sent for Sheriff Thomas Lawson. He left the small town of Eminence on horseback, the snow so thick it seemed to swallow the sound of his approach, the world muffled and waiting. The path to the Caldwell cabin was a lonely one, winding up a ridge above the frozen Jack's Fork River, a place where families kept to themselves, where the silence was usually a comfort, not a threat. Lawson's official report, filed later that night, would be a masterpiece of understatement, the sterile language of the law failing completely to capture the chilling strangeness of what he found. It reads simply, "Property found cold, no signs of life though house in order. One child present, condition unusual." But what he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. The cabin stood there, still and dark against the white snow. No footprints leading away, not a single track. The door was unlocked, which was the first thing that felt wrong. Robert Caldwell was a cautious man. Inside, the air was colder than the grave, a deep, penetrating cold that clung to the very wood of the walls. The main room was immaculate, scrubbed clean, everything in its proper place. On a small pine table, a single teacup sat half-filled. Its contents had frozen solid, a delicate crust of ice that shattered when Lawson's gloved finger touched it. The stove was dead. Only gray, lifeless ash remained. He moved through the small home with a growing sense of dread, each room a perfect, undisturbed diorama of a life that had simply stopped. In the master bedroom, the bed was made with military precision, the sheets pulled taut at the corners. Robert's work boots stood side by side at the foot of the bed, as if waiting for him to step into them. On the dresser, Mary's hairbrush still held strands of her dark hair, and her silver brooch lay next to his pocket watch on the mantel. Nothing of value was taken. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no frantic packing. It wasn't a home that had been fled. It was a home that had been vacated, as if the occupants had dissolved into the air itself. The only thing that broke the icy stillness was the unnatural warmth emanating from the smallest room at the back of the cabin. Lawson pushed the door open, and the scene that met his eyes would be forever burned into the memory of Shannon County. There, at a narrow desk, sat 12-year-old Clara Caldwell. The air in her room was strangely, inexplicably warm, though there was no fire, no lantern to account for it. She didn't turn when the sheriff entered. She didn't even seem to notice him. Her posture was ramrod straight, her small hands blackened with ink up to the wrists, as if she'd been writing not for hours but for days, without sleep, without pause. And the writing, it was everywhere. Pages torn from tablets were pinned to the walls, covered in symbols and diagrams that sprawled across the wood itself. Her desk was a mountain of notebooks, every square inch crammed with a dense, alien calligraphy of numbers, geometric shapes and equations that Lawson, a man of simple arithmetic, couldn't begin to comprehend. He could only sense their impossible complexity, their deliberate, almost manic order. He described it later as the work of a practiced hand, too advanced for her years and multiplied to an unnatural excess. This wasn't a child's doodling. This was something else entirely. Something had been unleashed in this room. Clara seemed to be in a trance. She blinked slowly, her eyes struggling to focus on the world beyond the paper in front of her. When Sheriff Lawson placed a hand on her shoulder, the touch felt like breaking a spell. She turned her head, her lips pale, her expression utterly blank. The cold that filled the rest of the cabin seemed not to touch her here in her cocoon of warmth and ink. For a long, unnerving moment, she said nothing. She just stared, not at him but through him. Then she spoke. And the words she chose would become the defining riddle of the entire affair. "They're gone," she said, her voice a flat, emotionless whisper. "They had to go, the numbers needed room. What do you do with a statement like that? What box does it fit in?" Lawson, a man of practical solutions, had none. He had the girl gently removed and taken to the Hayes residence for care, while his deputies began a search of the surrounding woods, the barns, the frozen riverbanks. They found nothing. No tracks in the unbroken snow, no disturbed earth, no shred of evidence to suggest where Robert and Mary Caldwell had gone or how they had managed to leave without a single trace. The official record for that day closes with a note that trembles with understated dread. Child in possession of extraordinary writings, parents unaccounted for, cabin otherwise undisturbed, further investigation required. And so it began, the story of a child who was no longer just a child. A child who had become a conduit for a kind of knowledge that seemed to have arrived from nowhere, a knowledge that came at a terrible price. The silence of that winter cabin wasn't an absence of life. It was the presence of something else, something that had demanded space and had taken it. There are things known and things unknown, and in between are the doors of perception. Aldous Huxley, that door for Clara Caldwell had just been kicked wide open. In the days that followed, the home of Dr. William Hayes, the town physician, became the first laboratory for observing the phenomenon of Clara Caldwell. His official notes, preserved in county records, paint a picture of clinical detachment. But it's his wife Judith's private journal that captures the true, creeping horror of what was unfolding. Dr. Hayes wrote, "Patient exhibits no inquiry about father or mother, shows no emotional reaction when pressed on their whereabouts. Clara ate when food was placed before her, mechanically, without expression, her eyes distant. She drank water only when the glass was held to her lips. Her vital signs were normal, but her entire being seemed disconnected, as if the person who once inhabited that body was now merely a passenger." But Judith Hayes saw something more. Her journal entry from December 20th, 1915, reads, "Clara filled 4 school tablets before supper. When no paper was left, she tore pages from William's medical almanac. I caught her marking the wallpaper with her inked fingertips. She seems unable to stop, even when her eyes close from exhaustion. It is like watching a wound that will not clot." The house itself was being transformed. It was being consumed by the child's relentless compulsion. Surfaces that were once familiar, walls, tables, even the floorboards, began to disappear beneath a creeping vine of scrolled equations, spirals, and dense clusters of symbols no one could decipher. At night, the only sound in the house was the faint, rhythmic scratch of her pencil, a sound like an insect chewing through wood, tireless and unending. Judith described waking one night to find Clara kneeling by the cold hearth, her small fingers tracing complex figures into the soot and ash. She was a machine for transcription, a machine that could not be switched off. Word began to spread through the small town of Eminence. Neighbors who had known Clara as a quiet, unremarkable schoolgirl now came to the Hayes' home to peer through the doorway of the spare room, watching her in hushed, fearful silence. They saw a child reduced to a mere instrument, her body a vessel for a relentless, incomprehensible flood of information. Some whispered of demonic possession, others simply recoiled from the sight of it, the sheer unnaturalness of a child so consumed. The local schoolteacher, Miss Ella Whitman, confirmed what everyone suspected. Just weeks earlier, Clara had struggled with long division. Now she was producing formulas that would have stumped the most brilliant minds at the state university. When the sheriff stopped by, bringing a fresh stack of notebooks, Clara filled nearly all of them within 24 hours. He asked her gently where she had learned such things. She looked at him with those same blank eyes. "I didn't learn them," she said. "They're just there." Dr. Hayes, in a desperate attempt to break the cycle, tried an experiment. For one day, he removed her paper and pencil, locking them in his desk drawer. The result was terrifying. Clara grew agitated, packing the room like a caged animal, her ink-stained hands pressing against the walls, leaving smeared, abstract patterns behind. She refused to eat. She muttered to herself in a low, constant stream of numbers and fragments of equations. She began clawing at the locked drawer, her fingernails splintering against the wood. By nightfall, fearing a complete mental and physical collapse, Dr. Hayes gave in. He returned her materials. The moment the notebook touched her hands, she grew calm, sat down, and resumed her work as if nothing had happened. She wrote without pause until the sun came up. Judith Hayes's final journal entry for that week is heavy with a sense of helpless dread. December 22, 1915. The child eats only if I set the plate directly in front of her. She does not thank me or even look at me. It is as if she no longer sees us at all. The papers pile high and still she writes. Her fingers are raw and cracked with ink, and yet she shows no pain. I do not believe she could stop, even if she wished to. The family home had become a prison, not for Clara, but for the Hayes family, held captive by the sheer, overwhelming output of this small, silent girl. The case had grown too large for a country doctor and a concerned sheriff. Word reached the University of Missouri. A colleague of Dr. Hayes relayed the story to Professor James Morgan, a respected mathematician with a professional interest in prodigies. Morgan was, by all accounts, a man of rigid logic, deeply skeptical of such rural tales. His initial response, recorded in a letter to a colleague, was dismissive. A frontier hoax, he wrote, more fit for pulp magazines than for serious academic papers. Yet something in the story, perhaps the sheer consistency of the reports, gnawed at him. On December 23, 1915, he boarded a train south, intending to expose the trick. He had no idea he was walking into a mystery that would not only defy his logic but would ultimately consume it. The academic world was about to collide with something it had no name for, and Clara Caldwell was about to be moved from domestic disturbance into the cold, unforgiving light of scientific inquiry. There is a whispered rumor from that time, a story that never made it into the official records. They say that on the night before Professor Morgan arrived, Judith Hayes dreamt of a house made entirely of paper, its walls covered in numbers that shifted and crawled like insects. In her dream, she heard a voice whisper, "The container is failing." When Professor James Morgan arrived at the Hayes household, he was a man expecting to find a clever fraud. What he found instead was a scene of intellectual chaos that shook him to his core. The spare room where Clara worked was no longer a room, it was a forest of paper. Notebooks were stacked in precarious, leaning towers. Loose pages, pinned to the walls, fluttered in the draft from the door. And the equations. They had spilled from the paper onto the plaster, the floorboards, even the underside of the desk, a relentless tide of symbolic logic. At the center of it all sat Clara, hunched and focused, her hands a blur of motion, her face smudged with ink. She didn't even flinch when Morgan entered the room. He took a seat, his skepticism still intact, and picked up the nearest tablet. Within minutes, his entire demeanor changed. His posture, once relaxed, became rigid. His face, once condescending, became a mask of disbelief. This wasn't a child scrawling. These were pages filled with non-Euclidean geometry, with differential equations of a complexity that would have challenged his own graduate students. There were proofs that seemed to lead to conclusions that contemporary mathematics had not yet reached. More disturbing still, there were calculations about the very fabric of space, about curvature and vibration, written with the casual confidence of self-evident truth. Morgan, the man of logic, was looking at a language he barely understood, flowing from the hand of a 12-year-old girl who, just weeks ago, couldn't solve a simple division problem. Can you imagine that? Your entire understanding of the world, of order and intellect, being dismantled in a small, ink-stained room in the middle of nowhere. Morgan spent 3 days in eminence, his time divided between Clara's overwhelming output and a flurry of urgent, almost frantic, correspondence with his colleagues back at the university. In a letter to his department chair, a letter now preserved in the university's archives, his professional composure completely cracks. He wrote, "I confess I have never seen the like. This child has produced material that would challenge the faculties of a trained mathematician. She operates not by rote learning, but as though she inhabits the principles themselves. I do not know whether to call this genius or something altogether different." He began discreetly sending pages of her work to trusted experts in different fields. The replies that trickled back only deepened the mystery. They confirmed his assessment. The work was not copied from any known source. A physicist in Chicago noted that some of the calculations seemed to anticipate concepts in relativity that were, at that time, still years away from being formalized. Another colleague remarked, with a sense of awe, that the girl seemed to be writing in a mathematical tongue that no one had yet learned to speak. The story, inevitably, leaked to the press. On December 28th, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch ran a sensational story with the headline, "Missouri's Miracle Child, a Girl Who Writes the Language of the Stars." The article painted Clara as a kind of savant, a backwoods prodigy touched by divine inspiration. It mentioned the disappearance of her parents only as a tragic footnote, a dramatic backdrop to the more thrilling discovery of a genius in the Ozark Hills. But Morgan saw no miracle. He saw something far darker. Professor Morgan's private notes from those 3 days reveal a growing unease that bordered on fear. He wasn't enchanted, he was horrified. He watched Clara's mechanical eating, her complete indifference to her surroundings, her unnerving failure to even mention her missing parents. "It is not the joy of discovery that drives her," he recorded in his journal. "It is compulsion. The work proceeds without pause, as though dictated by some unseen necessity." He understood then that the Hayes household was no longer a suitable place for her. It wasn't about care anymore. It was about containment and study. He lobbied Sheriff Lawson and Dr. Hayes, arguing that Clara needed to be moved to a facility equipped to handle such an extraordinary and fragile case. His letter to the state board was blunt and urgent. The child's condition represents a phenomenon beyond the scope of domestic guardianship. Continued exposure risks both her health and the preservation of these invaluable writings. I recommend immediate transfer to Missouri State Hospital No. 4 for controlled evaluation. The sheriff, exhausted by the fruitless search for Robert and Mary, agreed. Dr. Hayes, overwhelmed and out of his depth, reluctantly signed off. And just like that, the machinery of the state began to turn. The press celebrated a miracle, but those who had stood in that room, who had felt the strange warmth and smelled the overwhelming scent of ink, knew better. They had witnessed a child being overtaken by something she could neither comprehend nor control. Clara Caldwell's story was about to move behind the locked doors of an institution, a place that promised answers, but would only provide a new stage for her slow, tragic, and inevitable decline. The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. If you try it, you will be lonely often and sometimes frightened, but no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself. Friedrich Nietzsche, Clara Caldwell, it seemed, no longer owned herself. On January 12, 1916, Clara Caldwell was delivered to Missouri State Hospital No. 4 in Farmington. The journey by wagon and train took 2 days. Sheriff Lawson's escort notes describe her as docile, quiet, and writing whenever permitted, filling page after page even as the frozen Missouri countryside rattled past the train window. The hospital was a modern brick complex, considered progressive for its time. But the records from those first few months don't tell a story of progress. They tell a story of decline. She was placed under the direct supervision of Dr. Alanna Reed, one of the few female psychiatrists in the state. Reed's case notes, which survive only in fragments after a suspicious fire destroyed many hospital files years later, provide the clearest window into Clara's condition. Patient age 12, Reed wrote. No signs of head injury or fever. Displays extraordinary cognitive ability in mathematics and physics with no evidence of prior training. The hospital became a new kind of laboratory. Professors from across the country traveled to Farmington to test her. Each one arrived a skeptic, and each one left deeply unsettled. One physicist from Johns Hopkins presented Clara with a set of French academic journals on mechanics. Though she spoke not a word of French, she took a pencil and moved it swiftly across the margins, crossing out symbols, adjusting notations. When the scholar had her corrections translated and reviewed, they were not just accurate, they were profound improvements. Another visitor brought German treatises on astronomy. Clara ignored the text completely, flipping straight to the diagrams and silently altering calculations that were, in fact, misprinted in the original editions. She wasn't reading the language, she was reading the math underneath it. Dr. Reed summarized the phenomenon in a stark, almost poetic memorandum. Patient accesses pure symbolic structure without mediation. She perceives errors in complex equations as readily as a normal person perceives a mismatched color or a discordant sound. In her interviews with Clara, Dr. Reed tried to find the source. The transcripts of those sessions are chilling. "Clara, can you tell me how you know these things?" Reed asked. Clara's reply was always the same. "They're just there now." "But you did not know them before December," Reed pressed. "Something must have changed." "Yes," Clara whispered, "before the cold night, before they went away." "Who went away, Clara?" "My parents," she said, her voice devoid of any grief. "They had to make room, it was getting crowded inside." That phrase again. They had to make room. She spoke of her parents' disappearance not as a tragedy but as a necessary precondition and clearing of space for the knowledge to enter. Experts who reviewed the case files debated diagnoses: savant syndrome, a fugue state, a psychotic break, but none of them fit. Dr. Reed, more cautious, noted that Clara had no loss of other functions. She could speak clearly, follow instructions, and recognize people. She was not mad. She was occupied. Hospital staff described her as being in a perpetual trance-like state. One nurse reported entering Clara's room late one night to find her standing at the window, sketching complex patterns in the condensation of her own breath on the cold glass, whispering a stream of numbers into the darkness. Another noted that during her long writing bouts, her hand never seemed to tire. It moved with a steady, mechanical precision, as if it were being guided by an invisible intelligence. By March of 1916, Dr. Reed's reports began to take on a more urgent tone. The awe was being replaced by medical alarm. She started documenting the physical toll: headaches that left Clara pale and trembling, spontaneous nosebleeds that would appear after hours of intense calculation. Her weight began to drop, despite a supervised diet. What concerned Reed most was Clara's utter indifference to her own failing body. "Patient notes discomfort but does not desist," Reed wrote in a report to the hospital director. "Persists until the point of collapse. The cognitive drive appears to outweigh the instinct for self-preservation." The official monthly summary for March closed with language that balanced on a knife's edge between scientific wonder and pure dread. "The Caldwell child demonstrates a level of knowledge that no reasonable model of cognition can account for, yet her health falters with every page she produces. One must ask whether the mind can contain what has taken residence here without the body failing in response." While the nation's newspapers were still lauding the miracle child from Missouri, the staff at Farmington were witnessing the truth. They were watching the first cracks appear in the small vessel that was her body. They were realizing that whatever knowledge she now carried, it came at a terrible price. And the price was Clara herself. There's a story, a rumor that circulated among the night shift nurses at Farmington. They said that on the quietest nights, if you stood outside Clara's door, you could sometimes hear two voices. One was the girl's, whispering numbers. The other was a voice they could never identify, speaking in a language that sounded like cracking ice. By April of 1916, the narrative of Clara Caldwell began to fracture. The wonder was souring into dread. The hospital records from this period read less like a medical chart and more like a logbook documenting the slow, systematic dismantling of a human being. The nurses' daily reports became a grim catalog of physical decay. Her writing sessions, once just a marvel, were now seen as the cause of her decline. Her face would grow impossibly pale within an hour of starting, a cold sweat dampening her collar even in the cool ward. By evening, she would be pressing the heels of her ink-stained palms against her temples, trying to silence a throbbing headache that no medicine could touch. Dr. Reed's notes on the epistaxis, the nosebleeds, became more frequent. They were never heavy, but they were persistent, always following her longest and most complex bursts of calculation. It was as if her body was trying to release a pressure that was building inside her mind. Then, in May, a new and far more alarming symptom appeared: sudden, inexplicable drops in body temperature. During periods of intense, uninterrupted writing, Clara's skin would grow cold to the touch. A thermometer confirmed what the nurses felt. Her temperature would plummet to as low as 94 degrees Fahrenheit. Dr. Reed described these episodes in her clinical notes, but it's a private letter she wrote to Professor Morgan that reveals her true fear. It is as if the very heat of her body is being consumed in the process of production, she wrote. Her mind is functioning beyond its natural capacity, and her flesh is paying the deficit. Despite the visible toll, Clara never stopped. She couldn't. The compulsion to fill pages, to cover every available surface with her equations, was more powerful than pain, more powerful than fatigue, more powerful than the instinct to live. One orderly testified that he saw her collapse mid-sentence during an afternoon session, her pencil still clutched in her fist. When they revived her with smelling salts, the very first thing she did was reach for the page, her hand finding the exact spot where the line had broken off, and she continued writing. These incidents led Dr. Reed to formulate what she privately called her vessel theory. She presented it in a memorandum to the hospital director. The patient is not inventing this knowledge, she argued. She is channeling it. The information does not arise from within her. It moves through her, like water through a pipe. And the human form, particularly that of a child, cannot sustain such immense pressure without rupturing. What we are witnessing is not madness, it is overflow. To test this radical hypothesis, Reed instituted a brief controlled restriction. For 72 hours in late May, all writing materials were withheld. Clara was given books, art supplies, and taken for walks in the hospital gardens. The change was immediate and startling. She slept for 12 hours straight. Her appetite returned. The color came back to her cheeks. Reed noted, for the first time since admission, the child displays ordinary affect. She smiled faintly when addressed. No headaches, no bleeding. For 3 days, it seemed like they had found a way to save her. They had their little girl back. But the reprieve was short-lived. The moment the restrictions were lifted, Clara returned to her desk with a terrifying doubled intensity, as if making up for lost time. Within a single day, the nosebleeds resumed. Within 2, her temperature dropped again. By the 3rd day, she was nearly insensible from exhaustion, her body slumped over the desk but her hands still moving, still scratching out the endless stream of symbols. The experiment had failed. Dr. Reed was forced to conclude that there was no sustainable balance. Suppressing the flow could alleviate the symptoms, but it caused a psychological agony that was just as dangerous. Allowing the flow accelerated her physical decay. It was an impossible choice. The witnesses to this slow-motion tragedy described the eerie, almost preternatural resolve with which Clara endured it all. When Dr. Reed asked her why she had to continue, why she wouldn't stop even when it was clearly killing her, Clara gave a reply that was preserved in the official transcript, a reply that sent a chill down the spine of everyone who read it. "Because it isn't done," she said, her voice a dry rustle. "It has to be finished. They're waiting for it." The "they" was never identified. Reed pressed her, who was waiting, what needed to be finished. But Clara's answers just circled back to that same, immutable phrase. It has to be finished. The clinical records for the spring of 1916 close with language that is no longer purely medical. It speaks of a child's body as a failing instrument, pushed beyond its design. It describes her mind as a conduit too narrow for what it carried. The initial promise that had drawn scholars and reporters to her story now darkened into a grim recognition. Whatever knowledge had entered Clara Caldwell was exacting its price, and the body of a 12-year-old girl was simply too small a vessel to contain it. All things are full of gods. Thales of Miletus. In the lonely wards of Farmington, the staff began to wonder what, exactly, Clara was full of. The official hospital ledger for April 22, 1916, contains a brief, chillingly sterile entry, written in the administrative hand of the hospital director, Dr. Franklin Pierce. It reads, "Two gentlemen from Washington, identifying as representatives of the Department of War, permitted a private audience with patient Caldwell. Duration, approximately 1 hour. No transcript recorded. No further details supplied." It is the only official document that acknowledges the visit, and it feels crafted to say as little as possible. They arrived without warning in a black motor car, a rare and imposing sight in rural Missouri. Staff members who saw them described them as middle-aged, clean-shaven, and dressed in dark, severe wool suits that seemed out of place in the quiet hospital grounds. Their names were never recorded. They presented papers bearing a federal seal, which Dr. Pierce accepted without question. Dr. Reed, however, noted in her private diary that the credentials looked hastily prepared, somehow unofficial. All nurses and orderlies were ordered out of the children's ward. Only Pierce, Reed, and the two strangers entered Clara's room. According to Reed's later, secret account of the meeting, the men didn't treat Clara like a patient. They treated her like a resource. They spoke to her in low, urgent tones, reviewing several of her most recent notebooks. One of them produced a sheet of complex equations from his briefcase and placed it in front of her. Clara scanned it for less than a minute, then took her pencil, made several swift corrections in the margins, and pushed the paper back across the table. The official nodded, folded the page without a word, and pocketed it. And that was it. The exchange was over. No record exists of what was said in that room. The hospital kept no stenographic notes, an omission that Dr. Reed found both highly unusual and deeply disturbing. In a letter she drafted to Professor Morgan but never sent, she described the encounter with a single damning phrase. It was the moment the case ceased being ours and became theirs. What is undeniable is the change that followed. Before that visit, Clara's decline, though steady, had been slow. In the days immediately following the visit from the War Department, her deterioration accelerated dramatically. She began suffering from prolonged, debilitating headaches, collapsing without warning in the middle of the ward. The notebooks she produced grew even more dense, the symbols more abstract and impenetrable than ever before. Nurse Martha Cunningham recorded in the ward log on April 27 that Clara fainted mid-sentence, her pencil dragging a final, jagged line down the page as her head struck the desk. When she was revived, she whispered something that the nurse wrote down verbatim. "It isn't enough anymore. They need more than me." The nurse noted that her voice was flat, without fear or panic, as if she were simply reporting a logistical problem. Dr. Reed's medical notes from this period reflect her growing alarm. "Patient demonstrates accelerated decline following contact with federal visitors," she wrote. "Frequency of hemorrhage increased. Body temperature highly irregular. Cognition remains intact but seems preoccupied with phrases of completion and insufficiency. It is as though she perceives herself as part of some larger process whose demands she can no longer meet." When Dr. Reed confronted Director Pierce, demanding to know who those men were and what they had done, she found him evasive and fearful. He insisted the hospital had no choice but to comply with federal authority, that refusal could bring severe consequences. Reed wrote in her private journal that she suspected Pierce had been warned, or perhaps even threatened, into silence and cooperation. By early May, the staff observed that Clara could no longer write for more than an hour at a time without collapsing into a deep, exhausted sleep. Yet even when she was unconscious, her hands would twitch against the blankets, her fingers tracing invisible lines, as if the work continued on some other plane of existence. The shadow of Washington now hung over the entire case. The notebooks, which had once been carefully preserved in the hospital's archives, began to disappear. Completed volumes were collected by Dr. Pierce and placed under lock and key. Reed noted that several were later recorded as having been removed for federal review. When she inquired further, she was told simply that the matter was now classified. The official hospital logs for April and May grew thin and vague, stripped of all detail, while Reed's private notes grew sharper, more desperate. "This child is being consumed," she wrote. "Her decline is being accelerated not by her own compulsion alone, but by an external demand. Those men took something from her and left behind an absence she is killing herself to fill." By June, Clara was a pale, faltering ghost of the girl who had arrived in January. Whatever the men from the Department of War had been looking for, it seems they had found it. And they had taken it with them, leaving Clara behind with only the crushing pressure of an unfinished equation. A chilling whisper from history. During World War I, intelligence agencies on all sides were desperately searching for unbreakable codes. Some cryptographers believed the key was not in creating new systems, but in finding a natural mathematical language that was inherently secure, a language no one had yet learned to speak. On September 7, 1916, a new figure entered the strange drama of Clara Caldwell. A woman arrived at Missouri State Hospital Number 4, identifying herself as Elizabeth Caldwell, the sister of Clara's father, Robert. The administrative file describes her as well-dressed, educated, and perfectly composed. She came armed with a portfolio of evidence. Letters she claimed to have exchanged with her brother, family photographs, and legal documents that seemed to establish her as Clara's rightful guardian. Dr. Pierce, perhaps relieved to have a solution to his increasingly problematic and scrutinized patient, accepted these papers at face value. But Dr. Reed, who had lived and breathed this case for 9 agonizing months, felt an immediate and profound sense of wrongness. In her diary, she described the visitor as convincing, yet unnervingly rehearsed. She noted that the documents looked too new, the ink on the letters not faded as one would expect from years of correspondence. Still, in the new climate of federal oversight that shadowed the hospital, Reed's suspicions carried little weight. Pierce wanted the problem to go away, and this woman was offering a neat and tidy solution. During her meetings with the hospital staff, Elizabeth wove a fantastic and convenient story. She spoke of a strange family affliction. She described a lineage of Caldwell children who had experienced sudden, inexplicable bursts of knowledge, episodes that always left them physically weakened, and in 3 previous cases had led to their deaths before adulthood. According to her, Robert himself had shown similar symptoms as a boy. She claimed that he and Mary had moved to the isolated Ozarks specifically to shield Clara from outside interference, should the family pattern reappear in her. This story, though completely unverified, was exactly what the hospital administration needed. It provided a context, a pseudo-medical explanation that shifted the phenomenon from something terrifyingly unique to a recurring, albeit tragic, genetic anomaly. It was entered into the official record as supplemental history, but Dr. Reed's private notes tell a different story. Visitor suggests a lineage of vessels, she wrote, her unease palpable on the page, as though what we observe in Clara is mere repetition, not anomaly. If true, it would explain the parents' silence and disappearance. Yet I cannot reconcile her calm, almost theatrical recitation with the complete absence of verifiable evidence. Professor Morgan, alerted to the situation, traveled from Columbia to Farmington in a desperate, last-ditch effort to intervene. He confronted both Dr. Pierce and the supposed aunt, arguing that removing Clara at this critical stage would not only endanger her life, but would also interrupt an essential and unprecedented course of study. In a letter discovered years later among his papers, he warned, "The girl's writings are too important to be consigned to secrecy and private care. To release her now is to erase what little understanding we have managed to gain." His protests were formally noted and then promptly dismissed. Dr. Reed recorded her final, chilling interview with Elizabeth on September 10th. She spoke of the family as if they were marked, Reed wrote. She said Robert and Mary had feared outside interference, but that the time for concealment was over. She claimed Clara was nearing the completion of something important. When I pressed her on what she meant, she simply smiled and offered nothing further. I left the meeting with the distinct and terrifying impression that she was not a relative. She was a custodian. On September 12, 1916, hospital records confirmed that Clara Caldwell was officially released into the custody of her aunt. A motorcar, the same kind the men from Washington had used, was waiting to carry them away. The official report, signed by a relieved Dr. Pierce, emphasized the legitimacy of the documentation and noted the promise of continued medical supervision by a respected physician in Springfield, Illinois, a Dr. Thomas Blackwood. but no trace of that address in Springfield or of that physician would ever be found. In the years that followed, Professor Morgan's obsessive investigation would prove what Dr. Reed had suspected all along. Robert Caldwell had no sister named Elizabeth. County archives, census rolls, and parish registers confirmed it. There was no Dr. Thomas Blackwood in any Illinois medical directory. The photographs were never seen again. The letters were never verified. The entire identity of the woman had been a meticulously constructed fiction. Within the hospital, the staff spoke of it in whispers. One nurse remarked that Clara had been handed off like a piece of classified material. Dr. Reed, in her final diary entry on the matter, captured the cold reality of the situation. Patient removed under questionable authority. Papers accepted, doubts ignored. A door has closed not on her illness, but on our ability to ever know the truth. And so, on a late summer morning, Clara Caldwell vanished from the official record, driven away by a woman who never existed. She disappeared as completely as her parents had, leaving behind only a growing mountain of questions and the cold, creeping suspicion that she hadn't been rescued, she had been acquired. The first casualty when war comes is truth. Hiram Johnson. The men who visited Clara were from the Department of War. You're not supposed to know this, but the file on Clara Caldwell was never a medical file. It was an asset file. For a brief period after Clara's removal, a series of letters arrived at the hospital, seemingly confirming that all was well. They came in neat envelopes with a Springfield postmark, signed with the elegant script of Elizabeth Caldwell. Their tone was reassuring, almost placid. The first, dated October 2, 1916, thanked Dr. Reed and the staff for their diligence. Clara is well settled now, it read. Dr. Blackwood has devised a gentle regimen that balances her health against her intellectual exertions. She is happier here, away from the institutional environment. She even spends time in the garden when the weather allows. Subsequent letters painted a picture of slow but steady recovery. They described a child regaining her strength, the headaches becoming less frequent, the writing sessions shorter. One letter from early 1918 was filled with a cautious optimism. Dr. Blackwood believes the episodes may fade entirely with maturity. We dare to hope for her future. Dr. Reed, though she never trusted the source, filed them away. They were, after all, the only thread she had left. But then the correspondence grew less frequent, and then it stopped altogether. The final letter, dated March 1918, was the last trace of Clara Caldwell that would appear in any official file for nearly 20 years. The silence that followed was absolute. 4 years later, in 1922, Professor James Morgan, still haunted by the case, decided to conduct his own investigation. Trusting his instincts over the official narrative, he traveled to Springfield, Illinois, determined to verify Clara's condition for himself. His personal notes from that trip read like the careful, methodical dismantling of a ghost story. The address provided in Elizabeth's letters did not exist. The street itself stopped several blocks short of the number she had written on the envelopes. He canvassed the neighborhood, but no one recalled a family matching their description. When Morgan inquired about Dr. Thomas Blackwood, the county medical register had no record of his practice. State directories did not list his name. No physician by that name appeared in any Illinois Medical Association records from that era. He was a ghost. Digging deeper, Morgan hired a genealogist to trace the Caldwell family line. The results were conclusive. Robert Caldwell had no sister. The entire story of Elizabeth Caldwell had been a fabrication, from her name to her family history. The photographs she had presented as evidence had been taken back when she left Farmington and could not be traced. The letters themselves, when Morgan had the handwriting analyzed by an expert, showed no consistency with known samples of Robert Caldwell's writing. The expert concluded they were likely written by a different person entirely. The conclusion was as unavoidable as it was terrifying. Whoever had taken Clara from the hospital had constructed an elaborate, multi-layered fiction, complete with names, addresses, and a 2-year-long correspondence, designed for one purpose: to create a cooling trail, to give them time to disappear without a trace. In his final summary of the investigation, Morgan wrote with the cold restraint of a defeated man, "We must accept that the girl has been removed under a false identity by an unknown party. Her present location and condition cannot be ascertained. The trail does not end with a death or a destination. It ends with a deliberate and successful act of erasure." When Dr. Reed learned of Morgan's findings, it confirmed her worst fears. Her diary entry for November 1922 contains a single, heartbreaking line. "The aunt was never an aunt, and now the child is nowhere." After that, the official record falls silent. Clara Caldwell, the girl whose mind had produced a torrent of information, a flood of numbers so vast it had overwhelmed everyone and everything around her, had vanished into a complete and total absence. The case, once so noisy with equations and speculation, now entered its longest and most profound silence. For nearly 2 decades, the story lay dormant, a ghost story told only in hushed tones by a handful of people, preserved only in the fragmented correspondence of an obsessed professor and the secret diary of a disillusioned psychiatrist. It would not be until 1938, when a young researcher, sifting through the dusty remnants of Professor Morgan's academic estate, stumbled upon the old files, that the name Clara Caldwell would surface again. And this time, it would be in connection with another woman, living under another false name, in another state, her life once again reduced to a steady, silent, and unending stream of numbers. The silence was about to be broken. There's a concept in intelligence circles called legend building. It's the creation of a detailed, verifiable, but entirely false backstory for an asset or an operation. The letters from Elizabeth Caldwell were not a correspondence. They were a legend, a story to cover a ghost. By the late 1930s, the Caldwell case had faded into folklore. It was a strange, half-forgotten tale from a bygone era. That is, until Dr. Harold Bennett, a young, ambitious researcher from the University of Chicago, stumbled upon it. While compiling case studies on child prodigies, he found passing references to Clara in the archived papers of the late Professor James Morgan. Intrigued by the cryptic notes and the sheer strangeness of the story, Bennett began a quiet, obsessive investigation of his own. He traced the few surviving witnesses, followed a cold trail of correspondence that eventually led him north, into the administrative records of a quiet, private sanitarium in rural Wisconsin. The institution was set far back from the main road, hidden in a thick grove of pine trees. It was a place for the wealthy to discreetly house their inconvenient relatives. Brick wings, barred windows, and a staff accustomed to the quiet routines of managing the chronically and hopelessly ill. There, Bennett was introduced to a woman who had been admitted in 1924, nearly 15 years earlier. Her file identified her only as Jane Doe. The admitting party, according to the sparse hospital records, was a middle-aged woman whose name had been withheld at her request. She had paid 10 years of the sanitarium's fees in advance in cash and was never seen again. The attending physician, an elderly Dr. Ruth Crawford, recalled the unusual admission. The patient was presented as a distant relative who had suffered a nervous collapse after the death of her parents, she told Bennett. No documents were provided. No family ever visited after that first day. She arrived in silence, carrying nothing but a small case of clothing. And from the moment she was shown to her room, she began to write. For 14 years, Jane Doe had remained in the exact same state. She spoke to no one. She responded only to direct, simple questions with a nod or a shake of the head. She passed her days from sunup to sundown, filling notebooks with dense, unreadable symbols. At first, the staff had collected and stored her writings, hoping they might offer some diagnostic clues. But as the years turned into a decade, the effort was abandoned. The notebooks filled crates, which filled closets, until they simply became part of the institution's forgotten background, another patient's inexplicable tick, tolerated but no longer questioned or understood. When Harold Bennett was finally granted access to that closet, his hands trembled as he opened the first crate. He knew immediately. The equations, the spirals, the strange geometric lattices, they bore a direct, unmistakable lineage to the fragments of Clara's work he had seen in Professor Morgan's files. This was not mere repetition. It was continuation. The same unique mathematical handwriting was there, but it had evolved. Where the Missouri notebooks had broken off, these resumed, elaborating on earlier themes, refining proofs, and extending into new patterns that were even more complex, even more abstract. Dr. Crawford admitted that no one on the staff had attempted a serious review of the material in years. "The writing is ceaseless," she told Bennett, with a tone of weary resignation. "She produces, on average, 3 to 4 notebooks a month. We long ago ceased to count them. Her health has declined steadily over the years, but she cannot be made to stop." The physical toll was horrifyingly evident. Jane Doe was a frail, skeletal woman, her skin sallow, her hands permanently stained with the ghost of old ink. She looked far older than her 37 years. During Bennett's visit, she sat hunched at a small desk by the window, filling a page with an unbroken stream of figures, her eyes fixed, her expression utterly flat. She gave no sign that she recognized or even saw her visitor. Her pencil never faltered. Bennett returned to the sanitarium half a dozen times over the next few months, each visit deepening his conviction. He brought with him copies of the pages from Morgan's archive and compared them, side by side, with the new work being produced in that silent room in Wisconsin. The handwriting was a perfect match. The notation, though it had grown in complexity, followed the same logical arc. The resemblance was undeniable. In his private notebook, Bennett recorded the moment of recognition with a sense of grim, understated finality. "This is not Jane Doe," he wrote. "This is Clara Caldwell." The work did not end in Farmington. It has continued here, uninterrupted and unobserved, for more than a decade. For the staff of the Wisconsin Sanitarium, she was just an anonymous ward, a forgotten woman whose endless writing was a harmless eccentricity. But for Bennett, she was the missing child from the Ozarks, still trapped, still a vessel, still carrying the impossible burden that had consumed her parents and confounded every person and institution that had ever tried to contain her. The great mystery of Clara Caldwell hadn't ended in 1916. It had simply been given a new name, buried under the sterile, anonymous label of Jane Doe. And in the quiet halls of that northern asylum, the girl who once told a sheriff that the numbers needed room was still writing, still giving them space, even as her own body, her own life, had almost no space left. The truth is rarely pure and never simple. Oscar Wilde. The truth of Clara Caldwell was not a single event but a continuous, consuming process, and it was not over. Dr. Harold Bennett made his final journey to the Wisconsin Sanitarium in the bitter cold of January 1940. Each of his previous visits had been the same. He would arrive to find the woman known as Jane Doe at her desk, the steady, rhythmic scratching of her pencil the only sound in the room. She never acknowledged him. The staff had long since given up trying to engage her in conversation. To them, she was a permanent fixture of the ward, the silent writer, a puzzle they had stopped trying to solve years ago. But Bennett couldn't ignore her. His certainty that she was Clara Caldwell compelled him to return again and again, to sit in quiet witness, to watch the relentless flow of symbols pass from her mind, through her hand, onto the page. He described it in his notes as a current that never ceases, a river of logic that flows through her, heedless of her body's capacity to contain it. By January of 1940, her physical state was alarming. She weighed scarcely more than 80 pounds. Her shoulders were stooped, her hands skeletal, yet they still moved with a quick, unerring precision. Her eyes, though dull and sunken, were always fixed on the paper. The nurses now had to feed her by rote, spooning broth into her mouth while her other hand continued to write. When Bennett pressed Dr. Crawford on the obvious risks, she answered with a sigh of complete resignation. "We've tried stopping her, doctor. She cannot survive it. Her body rebels. It is better to let her continue than to watch her suffer the alternative." Then on the afternoon of January 14th, the silence of 2 decades was broken. Bennett was seated near the window, observing her as she worked. Without any warning, Clara Jane set down her pencil. She raised her head slowly, and for the first time since he had met her, she looked directly at him. Her eyes, for a brief moment, seemed clear, focused. And then she spoke. For the first time in 16 years, her voice was heard in that room. "It's almost complete now," she said. Her words were flat but perfectly distinct. "They're coming back for it soon." Bennett, stunned, recorded the moment with the precision of a scientist. He noted the steadiness of her tone, the complete absence of emotion, the clarity of her articulation. It wasn't a cry for help. It wasn't a moment of madness. It was a statement of fact. Staff members who were nearby later corroborated the event, though none could explain it. When Bennett, recovering from his shock, tried to question her, "Who is coming back, Clara? What is complete?" She had already turned back to her desk. She picked up her pencil and returned to her writing, as if the immense effort of speaking had been expended and there was nothing more to say. 3 days later, on the morning of January 17, 1940, a ward nurse found her dead. She was seated at the same desk, her head bowed peacefully, her pen still held loosely in her hand. A fresh page lay before her, filled from margin to margin with her dense, elegant notation. She appeared to have completed the final line just moments before she died. Dr. Crawford's official report listed the cause of death as heart failure secondary to malnutrition and exhaustion, but she noted the circumstances with an uncharacteristic touch of unease. "Patient discovered upright posture natural, pen in hand," the report reads. "No sign of struggle. Expression described by staff as peaceful, almost relieved." The notebooks, hundreds of them, the product of 16 years of silent, continuous labor, were collected by Bennett for analysis. He described them as a single, continuous body of work, a coherent system of logic that was internally consistent, yet completely irreconcilable with any known framework of mathematics or physics. It was a language unto itself. The relief on her face at the moment of death was noted by more than one witness. The attending nurse, quoted in Bennett's journal, said it best. "She looked," the nurse said, "as if she had been carrying something impossibly heavy for a very long time, and at last she was allowed to set it down." Within months of Bennett securing the notebooks, they would vanish, seized, according to scattered testimony, by government officials who arrived without warning and without explanation in 1954. But for those few who stood in that cold ward on that January morning, the last image was the one that endured. A woman who had lived most of her life under a name not her own, compelled to write until the very end, finally silent, her pen resting on a page she seemed to believe was, at last, finished. Her first words in 16 years had also been her last. "It's almost complete now. They're coming back for it." There is an apocryphal story, a piece of dark folklore in the intelligence community. It's said that the equations from Clara's final notebook were used as the basis for a communication system that didn't send messages across space, but across time. A project that was shut down when the replies they started getting weren't from the future, but from somewhere else. In the spring of 1962, nearly half a century after Robert and Mary Caldwell vanished into the cold Missouri air, a county road crew was cutting a new stretch of gravel road near the old, abandoned homestead. A bulldozer blade, churning through the shallow, rocky soil, struck something that wasn't a rock. It was bone. Construction halted. By that evening, the site was cordoned off, the quiet woods suddenly filled with the grim, methodical work of the Shannon County coroner. What the investigators unearthed in the days that followed sent a fresh shockwave through the old, dormant case. They found two skeletons, one male and one female, their age at death estimated to be between 30 and 35. Their condition suggested they had been buried sometime during the winter of 1915 to 1916. Though time and soil had destroyed most evidence, the circumstantial conclusion was strong. These were the remains of Robert and Mary Caldwell. But it wasn't the discovery itself that was the most disturbing part. It was their arrangement. The bodies had not been buried side by side in a conventional grave. They had been positioned with a bizarre and meticulous symmetry. Their heads pointed inward towards a central point, their arms extended, their bones aligned to form a deliberate geometric shape. Photographs from the coroner's file show a configuration resembling a complex polygon, its proportions unnervingly exact. The coroner, a Dr. Alan Wexler, was so struck by the strange pattern that he consulted a local mathematics teacher. The teacher noted that the geometry bore a striking similarity to diagrams found in the few surviving examples of Clara Caldwell's early notebooks. When those notebooks were retrieved from the state archives and re-examined, the comparison was unavoidable and horrifying. The arrangement of the skeletons in the earth perfectly mirrored a specific notation Clara had drawn over and over again in the winter of 1915. A lattice of intersecting lines and arcs whose meaning had always been a mystery. Dr. Wexler's official report, dated June 14, 1962, is a document of precise, clinical terror. "Remains not scattered," he wrote. "Position indicates intentional placement. Pattern corresponds to a geometric figure associated with Clara Caldwell's recorded writings. Cause of death is undetermined. Skeletal trauma is absent. No sign of struggle or animal interference. Burial was shallow but deliberate." The discovery reignited the old whispers, the forgotten fears. What had really happened in that cabin? Had Clara killed her parents? Or had they willingly participated in some incomprehensible ritual? Her words from all those years ago echoed with a new, terrible meaning. They had to go. The numbers needed room. It seemed the numbers didn't just need room on paper. They needed room in the very earth itself. The local newspapers carried brief stories, but they were stripped of the more disturbing details. They reported only that human remains, believed to be the missing Caldwells, had been found. The geometric arrangement, the most crucial and terrifying part of the discovery, was omitted from all public releases. By then, Professor Morgan and Dr. Reed were both gone, unable to see this final, grim validation of their fears. The grave site seemed to confirm what Reed had suspected all along, that the family's disappearance was not a random act of violence, but a necessary part of a larger, incomprehensible design. On July 2, 1963, Shannon County officially closed the Caldwell file for good. The final line in the courthouse ledger reads with the cold, bureaucratic finality of a world tired of mysteries it cannot solve. Robert and Mary Caldwell, deceased by means unknown. Clara Caldwell, whereabouts unknown, presumed deceased. For the county, the case was over. But for those few who have seen the coroner's photographs, the image of those two skeletons, arranged with perfect mathematical precision on the edge of a lonely Missouri road, remains a chilling, unanswered question. It was the geometry of her notebooks made flesh, or rather made grave. The silence of the cabin in 1915 had left a mystery. The soil of 1962 returned the bodies, but it did not return the answers. It only made the original question that much darker. Among the fragments of Clara's writings that survived, there is one line scrawled in the margin of a half-filled notebook. It is not an equation. It is a statement. It reads, "The knowing wants out. It was never meant to be kept inside something as small as a person." That single line, more than all the complex equations, has shaped how the few who know this story have come to understand it. Clara was not the source of the knowledge. She was the conduit. She was the first point of rupture, and the knowing, it seems, was contagious. Those who tried to study her, who placed themselves too close to her work, found their own lives bending toward the same strange, destructive pattern. Dr. Alanna Reed, the psychiatrist who had fought so hard to understand, resigned from the hospital in 1924, officially due to exhaustion. But her private journals, discovered decades after her death, tell a different story. She described recurring dreams she called geometric landscapes. She wrote of vast, empty plains marked by intersecting lines, of spirals extending beyond sight, of a sky fractured into a perfect, crystalline grid. At first she dismissed them as a consequence of her intense focus on Clara's notebooks, but then the images began to bleed into her waking hours. "I close my eyes and see not blackness but diagrams," she wrote. "Every wall, every floor is now overlaid with a net of figures." Colleagues noted her growing distraction. One nurse recalled finding her late at night, tracing patterns into the condensation on a window just as Clara once had. Her health began to fail. Loss of appetite. Sudden chills. Nosebleeds. The same symptoms she had once so carefully documented in her patient. Fearing a complete collapse, she withdrew from medicine and lived her final years in near-total seclusion. Professor James Morgan's trajectory was just as unsettling. After Clara was taken from Farmington, he never relinquished the case. It became his life's obsession. He began publishing academic papers that leaned less on conventional mathematics and more on the strange, alien notations found in Clara's work. His colleagues, once his peers, began to shun him. One review of his 1929 article on translational geometries dismissed it as mathematical ghost stories, a label that would haunt him for the rest of his career. His funding dried up. Invitations to conferences stopped. By the 1930s, his lectures were attended only by a handful of curious students who came to hear the ramblings of the man they called the prophet of the numbers. His final, unpublished manuscript was an attempt to build a complete framework based on Clara's logic. The pages are filled with sketches that are eerily similar to the geometric arrangement of the skeletons found at the Caldwell grave site years later. In the margin of one draft, he scrawled a desperate, cryptic note. Her work continues, whether we acknowledge it or not. We are all just fragments in a greater notation. He died alone in his study in 1948, surrounded by stacks of his own incomprehensible work and the copied notebooks of the girl who had set him on this path. Both Reed and Morgan, the psychiatrist and the mathematician, had entered the case as objective observers. Both ended their lives consumed, not by Clara herself, but by the residue of the knowledge she carried. They had tried to contain the mystery, but instead, the mystery had contained them. Even after Clara was gone, the place where it all began, the small, rotting cabin in the Ozark Hills, retained a strange power. By the 1920s, local children called it the Numbers Cabin. They whispered that the markings on the walls could never be scrubbed away. Farmers claimed their livestock would refuse to go near the property, that the air around it felt unnaturally still and heavy. By the 1930s, it became a local test of courage for teenagers. Oral histories, collected decades later, are filled with stories of dares. They speak of feelings of intense dizziness, of sudden, unexplained nosebleeds, of hearing what they called counting voices in the dark. One account from a 1932 high school yearbook claims a student who spent a night there woke up for a week straight to find sequences of numbers scratched into his textbooks, in a handwriting that was not his own. The local sheriff, tired of the trespassing complaints, finally ordered the cabin burned to the ground in 1939. Witnesses said the fire behaved strangely. The flames spread slowly, reluctantly, despite the dry old timber. The smoke rose in a single, perfect column, straight up into the sky, defying the wind. But the fire didn't end it. Throughout the 1940s and 50s, hunters and hikers reported that the clearing where the cabin once stood remained wrong. Compasses would spin uselessly. Small campfires refused to catch. In 1958, the Army Corps of Engineers established a temporary research station on the ridge nearby. They never said what they were researching. They were there for 6 months with surveying equipment and strange antennas, and then they left as abruptly as they had arrived, dismantling everything. The cabin was gone, but the geometry remained, an invisible scar on the land itself. The file on Clara Caldwell ends in silence, a cabin reduced to ash. A family unearthed decades later, their bones arranged like the very diagrams their daughter drew. A child who vanished only to reappear as a ghost in a northern ward, writing until her last breath. And that one terrifying line, a whisper from a forgotten notebook, the knowing wants out. What was it that poured through her? Was it genius? Was it madness? Or was it something else, something ancient and intelligent that simply needed a hand to write its story? Her case is officially closed, but the pattern repeats. Other whispers, other files, tell of other children in other times and other places, who suddenly began to write languages they were never taught, who saw patterns the rest of us can't see, whose bodies collapsed beneath the weight of a knowledge that was not their own. They may have erased Clara's name and seized her work, but the question that she opened up has never been answered. If you've made it this far, you're no longer just a listener. You're a witness. Comment with the exact time and country you're in now. Let's mark the moment this forgotten story reached you. What do you think was happening to Clara Caldwell? Was she a conduit for something alien, something divine, or something else entirely? Let me know your theory below. And if you believe that some histories should not be allowed to disappear, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. There are more buried truths waiting in the archives, waiting for someone to give them a voice before they too are erased forever.